talking a little bit about some tools we've put in East to help predict the future course of a trial. And of course, that's always something people want to know for a variety of reasons, whether they're statistical reasons, planning reasons, or business reasons. And so the agenda is quite simple. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the motivation, which is basically what made us think of putting these things into East. And there are a few presentations, trials that sort of illustrate that. And then really jumping into what East Predict, which is really the module of East that allows you to do some of these things, can do, and show you a bit of a small demo to show you what it looks like. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. So this is a first motivating example. This was a talk given by Yili Pritchett of AbbVie, now at MedImmune, in 2012. So a few years back, she gave a talk on enrollment speed, data heterogeneity, and outcome of adaptive designs. And I found it quite intriguing because a lot of people talked about adaptive designs, of course. And I don't know, it must have been around the time where some examples of trials actually being done were starting to be discussed. And so people were starting to talk about the operational hurdles, the regulatory hurdles, and so on and so forth. And she described a multiple look adaptive dropping arm design. This was a Bayesian design. It was phase 2, but a rather large trial, about 260 patients. And that trial stopped for futility. I'm going a little bit ahead of myself, but I'm not going to describe the design of the trial very much. Needless to say, it was adaptive, and it had multiple interim looks. It was Bayesian in flavor, so it could change the sample size as you went along, and was calculating predictive probabilities to decide what to do next. And she highlights 3 things in her talk. I'm going to mention 2 of them. So one of them was that enrollment ended up being faster than expected, and there were no savings in sample size. They stopped for futility, but they had enrolled everybody. Another one was that there was data heterogeneity across participating regions. And this was hinted at. It didn't actually, I don't know if it really happened. Well, it may have. It was misleading at the interim analyses, and I'll go over this. So here's a picture from her slides. I'm just sort of going over some of her slides here. But when they designed the trial, they naively sort of said, OK, the projected enrollment speed is 20 patients per month. Okay. Based on that, at what their 3rd interim analysis was planned to be, and this was supposed to be after 140 patients had finished the study, they were planning to be at 200 subjects, so a saving of 60 subjects. If the trial stopped at the 3rd interim analysis, they would have data on 140 patients. They would have enrolled 200, but their target was 260, so they could expect a benefit of saving 60 patients when stopping the trial. Now, what actually happened is what's here, is that enrollment did not look linear or whatever they assumed, right? It crept up. They had took about 230 days to get 100 subjects. They were at 240. So 230. That's almost the entire sample size. There were 240 a little later on, and by the time of the interim analysis, their accrual was done. So there's no savings. They stopped the trial for futility, which is great. You get to, well, in some sense, it's great. But the hope was that they would save sample size, obviously. So, the important message is controlling enrollment speed. And, what typically happens is, you can see here, these are 4 participating countries. Country A started right from the beginning accruing. Country B started getting patients around day 100. Same for country C. And country D started getting patients around day 250. So there's considerable variation between sites, of course, but between countries. And this sort of plays into the fact, I mean, ideally, I haven't put it here, but in her slides, she shows, the ideal pattern for an adaptive design is whenever the interim analysis is about to show up, you sort of slow down accrual, which is very difficult to make happen in practice, but ideally, you sort of slow down so that you can make your decision, and then you pick up accrual again. So that's the idealized version, but this was, a particularly not the best picture. Now, in addition to that, there was this data heterogeneity issue. And they had a particularly bad one. So you can see on the y-axis is improvement. Here's 0. And data from the first enrolling countries was up here. So an improvement, right? And remember, this stopped for futility. So n equals 14 countries. This is what happened. You got a positive treatment effect. And the last countries come in, and they have a negative treatment effect. Right? And the problem, as I mentioned about interim analyses, is if you had taken interim analysis here, this is sort of reminiscent of maybe the sunitinib example in some sense. Is you take the interim analysis, everything looks great. Let's keep going. And then here, this was a futility stop, but sometime later, basically, you see that. So you don't always get this kind of divergence where the treatment effects actually have qualitative differences. It might be that the baseline hazards are different in a survival study, but certainly everybody knows that there's multi-regional differences, and you'd like to plan for that. Here's another example that's in a paper by Pocock. This is actually a series of 4 papers, which I highly recommend, on designing clinical trials in cardiovascular settings, but has a lot of good statistical principles. And in the 3rd paper, if you need to go look this up, he brings up a big cardiovascular trial called TopCat, which had a very similar problem. So there were 6 countries, 230 sites or something like that. 4 of the countries, US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil. This is the survival, the Kaplan-Meier, with a hazard ratio of 0.82 as estimated. And then 2 countries, Russia and Georgia, had a hazard ratio of 1.1, so the other direction, right? So I've selected some extreme examples here, but what we wanted to do in EAST was to allow you to not just model recruitment as a single, as a straight line or even a piecewise line, but allow you to actually put in information about countries and sites and get a little bit more granular in how you model things. The other piece, which I'm not really going to talk about, but that is in Predict, and I just want to mention it, is predicted interval plots. So these are methods developed by L.J. Wei at Harvard University with Scott Evans and a few others, Lucian. And it's in the same spirit. You're going to predict the future course of the trial, but instead of just predicting enrollment or the effect size, the hazard ratio, you actually, not just predicting the enrollment or the number of events, you actually predict the effect size and its associated confidence interval. So this is 1,000 simulations where the confidence intervals, predicted confidence intervals at the end of the trial or at a future look, have been stacked in a particular way so that they're sort of ordered. And the nice thing about this is that you can then sort of see, if you draw a line here, which is hazard ratio of 1, then you've got, I don't think it's written here, but you've got a certain percentage of the confidence intervals that are clearly excluding 1, and then another percentage of the intervals that are including 1. So you can make some statement about what's the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis, which you get with conditional power. However, this, in the same way that confidence intervals give you more information than estimates or p-values, you have a lot more information here. So for example, you can just take 0.8. Well, okay, so this is generated assuming the hazard ratio is 0.8, and only 5% of future simulations show a point estimate for the hazard ratio that is smaller than 0.798, right? So, no, right here. So even though a number of these exclude the null, there are only 5%, only 5% of the time are you actually going to get an estimate of the hazard ratio that is less than 0.8, and suppose that's the clinically meaningful effect, then yes, you could reject the null, but are you going to get an estimate at the end of the trial that is going to be meaningful in any sense? And this picture sort of gives you that greater picture just by drawing out the intervals rather than just the point estimates or just showing you one number like the conditional power. The conditional power can actually is just the number of intervals that exclude 1. So you can just get that from the picture too. So in EAST, you can actually create these designs. We released Predict last year, and we've improved it. And one of the things I'll be showing you is that we originally sort of, to produce such a plot as this, you basically need to be unblinded at the interim analysis. So it might be useful if you're in an earlier phase of development or you're in an open label setting. Well, not exactly, but in a setting where you have access to the data and you can put it in there and get this kind of plot. Or you provide this as a tool to the unblinded party, so the data monitoring committee or the independent statistician, who can produce such a plot and share it with the DMC so that they have more information to decide whether to stop the trial or not. Right? Similarly, with enrollment predictions and event predictions, the earlier versions of EAST used unblinded data. We have actually sort of changed that because as a sponsor, you don't usually have access to unblinded data in late-stage trials. So Predict was primarily developed with the idea that you could predict a trial on an ongoing basis, sort of simulate the rest of the trial. It also allows you to do some of these simulations at design time. And it allows you to, as I mentioned, create those PIPs, what we call PIPs, Predicted Interval Plots, that help DMCs make better decisions about early termination. Or even in adaptive design in the sample size re-estimation sense. And we're working on that, trying to develop PIPs both for an SSR or dose selection setting, as well as trying to develop Bayesian versions of PIPs. So those are sort of some of the ideas for future development. But if you're interested in just trying to predict enrollment and events with an idea to knowing when will enrollment end, when will your study end, when will an interim analysis happen, then there are these other tools which I'm going to go through right now, which you can use in Predict, and which may or may not use site-level data and patient-level data. So the questions to consider are basically, what are you trying to predict? So are you trying to get a hold of when enrollment will end and how many countries you need or how many centers you might need and whether you're in trouble or not? Are you trying to figure out when the end of the study will be, which is important for planning purposes of the program? And I'm sure everybody on the team is asking you, when will the trial end, especially if it's event-driven, since there's a lot of uncertainty there. Or is there an interim analysis or a specific milestone of any kind that you're trying to get some kind of certainty as to when this will happen so that the team can prepare for that. So that's one question to think about. The other one is whether it's event-driven or not. So you'll see in EAST that there are options to predict only enrollment. And if you've got an endpoint that is more like a continuous or binary endpoint, you sort of know when the readouts will be, then you don't really need to do the event-driven aspect of things. And then the event, you can also predict enrollment and events. So the question of whether it's an event-driven trial comes up in that regards. The other question, which I mentioned a little bit, is are you doing this in an unblinded setting? You're unblinded to treatment assignment, or are you blinded? And depending on whether you do one or the other, you obviously have more information to play with if you're unblinded. And so you can do either one of these in EAST. Some of the other things that affect some of the choices you'll make in the interface are, has the trial started? Or so are there data already? And so you're trying to project based on the data that you have? Or you're at the beginning of the trial and there are no data and you're just sort of going on assumptions exclusively? Is the accrual over? And this is important for event-driven aspects, because if accrual is done, then you know that all the patients are in the trial. It's just a question of trying to predict when their events will happen. So some of them have already happened, and all the others are at risk, and you're just trying to figure out, predict when will survive, how long will they survive, or how long will they, till they progress. If the accrual is not complete, then you have another category of patients. You have the patients who have had an event, the patients who are in the trial but have not had an event, and the patients that are yet to be recruited and who will have an event. And they may be different, so you may want to make different assumptions about that. And then there's a question of, do you have all the data available to you? Or do you just have top-level summary statistic data? Like, there's 200 patients, 52 events, but you don't know exactly when those events occurred and so on. That goes, you can predict using both aspects, and there's some, slightly different assumptions because of those. So I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like here in EAST. To motivate that, I'm using an example that we've been using for a while now, but it's a real example, which is why we keep reusing it rather than sort of make stuff up. And we have some of the data for this. So this is a trial in oncology where the primary endpoint is OS, 90% power. This is phase 3, of course. One interim analysis with some pretty conservative boundaries for efficacy and futility. And what's driving the power is a median control arm, with a median OS of 5 months and an improvement of 0.71 hazard ratio. So if you can calculate this, so the plan was to enroll this in 24 months and be done 6 months later, right? And that turns out to be 374 events, 460 patients. So we can reproduce this relatively easily. Yes?
Why did you choose boundary, comma, minus 5 instead of
I don't know if there's a specific reason for that. It's close.
It's close, but it's a little bit better than O'Brien-Fleming, I think, because the O'Brien-Fleming is so very conservative at that. Or maybe it's not. At the very first look, that O'Brien-Fleming boundary is almost impossible to achieve, whereas this one is a little less on that extreme. But otherwise, it has very similar operating characteristics.
Yeah. They're very similar, but in any case, this is illustrative. And I don't know, I tried to improve the resolution here, but somehow it's not great. So hopefully you can read. This is just to show you what goes into the design, so you get an idea. And I can point out to some things that are new in the software if you're familiar with it. But this is designed for a 2-sample test, log rank. And so we put in the type 1 error, 0.025. you can put in the power, but in this case, we just put in the number of events that we need. Turns out that you need 460 sample size. And just a bit about the color coding. I mean, some of you who will be there tomorrow will discuss it some more. But yellow is usually output. That's sort of our color coding. Pink is usually cells where you can put multiple values for an input. And we're not doing that here, but that's, if you're wondering what these colors are about, that's what it is. So here I'm putting a 5-month median survival time, 0.71 hazard ratio. I'll just point out something else that's new in 6.4, which is allowing you to calculate probability of success, so a Bayesian version of power for survival designs. So you'd have to check that box, in which case you'd start getting questions about what your prior is and all that information. On another tab, you get to put in your input about your interim analysis, basically. So what is efficacy, what is futility? You can see the gamma -5 here, and here you get a preview of what the boundaries look like. And there are different scales you can play with. I'm not going to go into those details either. And finally, there's some information about accrual and dropouts. So this is sort of the very simple version of putting in your accruals and your dropouts. Here I'm basically saying accrual is going to be 24 months, and I'm going to be done 6 months later, so a study duration of 30 months. And I'm just assuming linear accrual. I mean, it's very naive. I could put multiple pieces to the accrual period and try to make it a little bit more realistic, but I'm going to do that differently later on. And then here you can put your probability of dropout. So by time 12 months, there's a 4% chance of people dropping out on either arm. So this is how you create a design. You can hit compute and get the output. I already have the output here, so I'm just going to show that to you because this is not really the focus. But you need 374 events, 460 subjects. This is the prediction of how things would break out. And then you get all sorts of characteristics of the group sequential trial, early stopping. So what's the expected sample size given that you may stop the trial? What's the accrual duration, the study duration, under various alternatives, and then the boundaries. So we saw a lot of this in what Cyrus presented. This is sort of the two-arm version. So now if you want to, so you can simulate the trial. But even at this point, because this is a very simple accrual situation, I can actually show you, this is just using analytic formulas. This is, we have a plot that sort of shows you sample size and events over time. So this is based on the expected accrual, which, as I said, was linear, and the expected survival, an exponential with these median OS of 5 and 7. This is what, when you could expect your events to come in. So if you need, let's see, 374 events, right? You can type that in up here. The bar goes up here, and it tells you this will happen roughly at 29.9 months. So you can use some of the things that are here to sort of play around with this plot. A lot of people like this plot quite a bit. If you hit this modify button, you can actually change the assumptions that are driving the event rates. So you can do this under the null or under any other alternative. But this is quite rigid because it's assuming an exponential, it's assuming a linear accrual, and you can loosen those things by going to simulations and using some of the predictive capabilities. So let me show you then how you would do that. So we've put in a tab here. And you can basically pick predict enrollment only, events and enrollment, given that you're unblinded, or events and enrollment, you have blinded data. And you'll notice we've moved this predict functionality into this analysis tab. So the predict functionality is disconnected from the design. And that's intentional because you may not want to predict, especially if you're blinded, you may want to do a prediction at any time, not just at the interim analysis. And so we don't want to require that you have data or that you monitor the trial in order to do the prediction. So it's been sort of taken out, but you can still use it. So I'm going to go with the blinded data, since that's a more interesting version of things. And you'll see here in this interface. So some of the questions I highlighted, now you see where you have to start making the choices. So based on some of these choices that you make, the interface sort of changes. So for example, do you have subject level data or do you have summary data? Yeah. And if you have summary data, it basically asks you, what is your current data? If you're in the middle of the trial and you've observed, say, 200 sample size, 100 events, number of dropouts, and then what's the current calendar time? Okay. So that's basically telling you that we are at this point. And because we're using sort of exponential models, there's a memoryless property that basically says it doesn't really matter what happened before, except that you know that you've accumulated X amount of events or X amount of sample size, so you need to predict or simulate n minus X of those, right? So if my sample size is 460, I think, then I know that I still have 260 patients to simulate for the future of the trial. 200 patients are already in the trial. And I'm looking for 374 events. If 100 have already happened, I know I don't need to simulate those 100. I just need to simulate the next 274. So it might be the case that you don't have much more granular data than this. And once you hit this next button, it'll ask you, well, what's the target sample size? So this could be your final sample size, 460. So one scenario is you want to know when will I accrue all 460 of my patients, and when will I get 374 events, right? So that could be your target. But your target could be when will the interim analysis happen, and that's meant to happen at 374 divided by 2, right? 187. So when will I hit my interim analysis? So you can set different targets based on what it is that you're trying to predict, which is why that's not necessarily the sample size or the number of events that the trial is designed for. It can be anything that you want right there. And then, as I said, this part is the simulation screen. So we know that we have 200 patients, 100 events, and now we want to simulate the rest of the trial. So you're going to get very similar screens to what you see when you simulate things in East, but it's basically asking you, how do you want to simulate the rest of the trial? The numbers that are actually in there by default, well, not in this case. If you have data, those numbers will be estimated from the data. But here you could put, I think you can put any hazard rate that you want. So you might use a hazard rate that's consistent with what you've seen before up to now, or you may change it, right? If you know that you're going to modify things in your trial and maybe change the eligibility criteria or something, you thought, you can sort of tell that that survival has been such that at this point probably the hazard rate is 0.035, but you think the patient population will change for some reason, you can play around with that number. And similarly, in the accrual and dropouts, you can play around with how accrual may look like in future. So, if the accrual rate so far has been 8.33, if you're falling behind or you're way ahead, you may want to slow things down or accelerate by adding sites. This is where you can play around with those assumptions. And once you hit the simulate button, you will get a simulation Yeah.
You mean you can have a piecewise?
You can also have piecewise hazards and piecewise accrual. So you can see here it's simulating. I just simulated 1,000 just for illustration, and it shows you what the prediction for the sample size and for the events. And then if you close this, then you can actually get so you get your simulation. I can put it here on the right, and then there's some full-fledged plots. So for example, enrollment looks like this. This is one of the plots I shouldn't have showed you because there's a bug that we were supposed to fix. So we're fixing this last night. Anyway, I'll show you another plot, but obviously this shouldn't be crossing here. This is a confidence band for your prediction. I think if I show you this one, so the enrollment will look a little bit more like the events. So this is a prediction of what the events will look like and when you may expect to hit various targets. So you can look at things two ways. You can say, well, where will I be after 55 months? Right? And so you can see after 55 months, I'll have somewhere between 245 and 280 events. Or you can do this based on events and say, when will I actually hit 374? And it looks like this is going to be an incredibly long study, right? It's not like the perfect example, but this is just illustrative of what can be done. I think we're short on time, but I do want to show you a couple of other things. So let me go back to the prediction. So I want to show you what happens if you actually have subject level data. So if you have subject level data, the simulation part, what comes in the next screen is very similar to what I showed you already. I'm not going to go through there. But what you have here is actually you can go and point to the data sets where you have that information and read them in. So for example, here, I happen to have brought this from a CSV file into East, but I have data that for the patients at the first interim look, and you can see what country they were in, what site, when did they enter the study. So this is in months, 3.38 months. How long were they on the study? Like when did they have an event or got censored? And then their status, were they lost to follow-up, censored, were they on treatment or not? The basic information that you need in order to basically run a log rank test, which you can do within the software, or that the software will do. So if you actually have data, it'll estimate accrual rates and hazard ratios and hazard rates based on the data that you've seen so far. And then those by default will be sort of plugged into the simulation part, so you can continue to simulate it according to that pattern. Or you could simulate something different. Just like I showed you, you can change things up and predict that that the future trials will be a little different. No, so this is in a blinded way. So if I read in this data, so you can do this unblinded, but if I do this blinded, so I put in my arrival time, time on study, and the status indicator. So there's no information about treatment. And you can, if you want to, as I do have in that particular file, if you have information about different sites, and that's a separate file, but if you have site level information, you can put that in there. So if you have, and I'll show you something different with sites. Just this is going to be a bit more complicated if I bring it in here, given the time we have. But here, if I do this without worrying about sites, just using the subjects as if they were one, regardless of sites, then I can go to the next bit. So here, the hazard rate will be based on what you've observed. It's a pooled hazard rate. So it's estimating that the hazard rate is 0.095 based on all the data. It doesn't know. It's just basically fitting a single log rank test or sort of extrapolating. So you can use that, or you can change it. You can say, oh, things are going to change in the next few months. And similarly, the accrual dropouts is based on what you've seen so far. So this has been the accrual rate, and then you can change what will happen next. So again, you can simulate this to get a picture of what's coming. So this is the blinded version. If you do the unblinded version, it'll ask you, what is the treatment assignment? And then you need to provide that, and then it can do a better job of estimating both arms, get you a bit of a more accurate picture, but not everybody has access to that. So right, so this is a little further along, and you're getting a prediction of where things will be. So the more data you collect, so it's actually showing you how events actually came into the trial. This is the data that you read into the software, and then it's simulating the rest, and so it's giving you a 95% funnel. This 95% can be adjusted. I didn't show you, but in the simulation controls, you can tell it if you want wider or narrower predictions. So combined with all of that, and I'll just show you high level what this looks like, but if you do a simulation, and I'm going to show you a simulation at the beginning of the trial, not with data, so not ongoing, though you saw that there was the site specific, so you can do that while the trial is ongoing, but you have to have set that up in the right way. But here, let me show you. Okay. So this is the usual sort of simulation screen for your trial. So there's test parameters, generating of the data, so response generation, which looks like this, right? So it's pretty simple. And then the accrual dropouts. So it looks a lot like what you saw in the design. So you can simulate things that way. But at this point, you can also bring in site information, so country and site information. So by checking this box, site, it basically just modified the screen here. And what you'll see is you can have different accrual models, so uniform or Poisson. You can have sites. The sites can be grouped by regions or countries or whatever grouping you want it to be. And you can read in that enrollment plan. So for example, we have one here. So I'll do that. I happen to have an enrollment plan already here. And it's meant to look like this. So what is the country or the region? How many sites are in that country or region? When will the sites open? A window during which the sites will open, and it'll sort of be random. What is the enrollment rate of sites in that country? And this will be either the mean of a uniform or the mean of a Poisson, depending on what you choose. And then are you capping that enrollment? Maybe some countries you don't want to enroll more than a certain number of patients. So that can be read into here by just saying specify enrollment and then just telling the software what the different variables are. Oops. I have the wrong data set. So country, number of sites, start and end of the activation window, and it basically brings it into here. And you can still edit this. So you can read it from a file, then you can edit it, or you can edit it from the start. So now you see all these countries, and you can simulate this. And so sites will open up in different regions at different rates. And I'm not going to do this right now. Well, I might as well. So you've got this checkbox that says include site risk as a stratum variable. If you check this, what happens is you get another column where you can categorize the countries according to a variable we call site risk. Okay. So you can give each country its own site risk. What I'm going to do, which is simpler, is just create two of them. So let's say high, high. I'm going to make them all high except the US for simplicity. Okay, so I'll make the US low. And if I go to the response generation tab now, what has happened is that my response generation got a little bit trickier. So you can use either a model, or in this case, I'm going to use these user-specified hazard rates. And this basically says that there are two strata, the high and the low, right? And so maybe high, it has a median control time of 5 months, and you're hoping for a true hazard ratio of 0.71, let's say. But in the low stratum, let's say the control arm is, so the baseline hazard is different, so 5.5 months, and you can even have the hazard ratio be different, so 0.83, right? So you're getting closer to basically having, so you could make it proportional hazard ratios, or you can even make the hazard ratio different. Now each region or country in the high or the low is going to generate data with different hazard rates depending on what stratum they belong to. And you can simulate this and see what happens, basically. So I just sort of randomly put in some numbers in there, but you can see how it affects power, which is hard to read, but power drops from 90% to around 80%, probably because of the different hazard ratios. And you can also look at what enrollment and events look like just as soon as this finishes. So this simulation, you can look at, say, enrollment. So you get an overall enrollment prediction, and you can actually also look at the various regions. So I can see that the UK looks like this, whereas the US looks like that. Right. Now, I'm not sure what this is. I need to fix that. But you can look at different regions, and same with the events. So that's the general idea. So that's basically what I wanted to present, sort of give you a quick tour and capabilities of what the prediction algorithms in East are doing. We're thinking of the next steps, trying to put more flexible survival options, other distributions, let's say, and add in other complexities that might be useful to the users. So with that.